Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I am back with another casting video, kind of. I mean, this is technically more of a recasting video, but here I'll be casting a season of Survivor First Boots at War. A season filled with only first boots from a Survivor season, though an added wrinkle to this to make this just beyond a more standard first boot season, I decided to shake this up quite a bit here by not just making it any first boot season, but a first boot season that specifically would have replaced Survivor winners at War. So that means that this season would have been Survivor 40, but even beyond that, I literally want to run through the entire cast of Winners at War and essentially swap out those players for players that were first boots. Trying to create this parallel between the two casts to a degree. Obviously, there's only so much you can really do here, but that is what we're going to be doing in this video. Running through the entire cast of Winners at War, talking about which first boot I would have replaced them with. So with that, let's jump right into the list. And I guess we'll going in Winners at War boot order, starting it off with Amber. And the replacement for Amber for me here is someone that I think you could argue was the person that Amber actually replaced on the real season. And the person I ended up going with here is Tina Wesson, who is a first boot, though obviously a strange one, the fact that she is obviously a winner of her first season, but then was the first boot on All-Stars. And this is something that I did very much debate, is this notion of, should I be including these returning players that were first boots? And if it was my personal list, I would say no. However, I do feel like we want to make this semi-realistic, make this a cast that actually production would put together. I do think production would allow the likes of a Tina Wesson on the cast, and even beyond that, when we're looking at this cast practically, I do feel like they would want someone like Tina on a cast like this to kind of bolster up the field a bit. Though Tina ends up being the only female returning player that ended up making the cut here, as I did not put on Sugar or Sierra Easton, so it is only Tina for the women at least. But again, I think having Tina on this cast, having this distinction of being the only winner on this cast, would add this interesting dynamic. And while it could obviously lead to just her being the first boot, due to that distinction, I did feel like it was at least an interesting enough prospect to put her on here. Next, moving on to Danny, and again, this one's not really a one-for-one parallel, though the person I end up replacing her with here is Gonzalez from Ghost Island. And again, on a season like this, I think Gonzalez is a pretty solid pick. I mean, one that is from a recent-ish season at this point in Survivor history. A decently notable first boot, one that I think definitely had some potential in the game, one that kind of got screwed over to a degree, and one that, again, I think in this position could be brought back. I think when it comes to physicality, I feel like Gonzalez and Danny kind of bring this similar amount of physical strength, and just as a whole, I felt like this is a good enough parallel here where she takes this spot. Next, moving on to Ethan, and this one was a pretty easy one as well. Now, the bigger question is, does this person want to come back, and would production even ask them back? But again, it's we're doing a first boot season. They're never doing this anyway. So here I did put Peter Harkey. And again, I think Peter Harkey, at least aesthetically, kind of just looked like an older Ethan at the time. And while Peter Harkey is now even older than that, I feel like this is a decent enough parallel here. I think having Peter back would have been interesting, considering he is someone that kind of played a more aggressive game back in the time of Survivor Marquesas. And for a cast like this, I feel like he makes perfect sense, especially when we're looking at the men that are eligible for this list. There aren't that many, as obviously just typically first boots do end up being women, so I can't be super stingy with the men picks here. So Peter did make it on here. Next, for Boston Rob, and the person I replaced Boston Rob with here ends up being the most recent first boot at the time, and that person is Ronnie Bardaw. Now, again, are there many comparisons between the two? Not really. I mean, they are both poker players. There's at least that. But again, I think in terms of physical strength, they're kind of comparable to a degree, especially in comparison for first boot season, where again, not the most physical grouping in the world. And I can see Ronnie being this more out in front leader figure that Boston Rob obviously is. So again, I felt like the comparisons were well enough there to put him on the list here. Next up for Parvati, and Parvati is an interesting one here, as I do feel like there are a couple of people that could take her spot. Where, as I mentioned before, a lot of the first boots are obviously women, and through that, a lot of women that were eligible for this list obviously did not make it onto the actual cast. Or the people I considered for Parvati in particular were people like a Michelle Chase, who would be an interesting returning. However, I just don't know if she would even want to play, and also I don't know if production would want her anyway. Semhar is another one, kind of similar thing. And then Rachel Aiko, similar thing as well, to where never got the sense that they particularly liked her. So the person I did put on in place of Parvati ends up being Marisa from Survivor Samoa, where, again, I think there's somewhat parallels here in the fact that they both tried to work with Russell Hantz. They're both obviously of a similar archetype, at least at the time. And again, Marisa showed some game acumen where I don't think she's the worst pick for a season like this, especially over the other people that were in this ballpark. So again, she made the cast for me. Next, moving on to Sandra. And I mean, there's not really a 1-for-1 comparison here either. But the two people I narrowed it down to here were Carolina and Marisa from Blood vs. Water. And to be honest, I think it's pretty close. I think if I'm going with who I personally would pick, I think I would probably go with Marisa. However, I did end up going Carolina here just because at least she was kind of mentioned outside of the scope of her season through the David Murphy situation, which, to be fair, production would probably just want to separate themselves entirely from it. But again, the fact that she was at least mentioned after her original season made me kind of lean Carolina instead. Though I think this is kind of a pick that could technically go either way. Next, I'm moving on to Yule. And Yule's a bit of a tough one here to where there's not really a direct comparison to him, with Yule being this smart athletic guy that is obviously tough to find in a first boot. And technically there is a later first boot that we'll talk about that I did consider for this spot. However, I did also try to balance out the tribes a bit in terms of physicality to where through that I did change a couple placements as well. However, the person I ended up swapping out with Yule here ends up being at least similar in the fact that this is a very white collar style player, one that held a very high position in their company, and that person is David Sampson from Survivor Cagayan. And again, is the David Sampson Yule comparison apt? No, not at all, but I feel like it was good enough here. And again, Dave Sampson's someone that I think they definitely would bring back for a season like this. So again, I felt like he was a solid pick here. Next, I'm moving on to Wendell. And for me, Wendell, I feel like there was a pretty easy swap out here. Someone in a similar archetype, someone that is younger, physical, seems very smart at the game, and that person is Darnell from Co Wrong. Again, definitely an anomaly within these earlier boots on the board of this seemingly well-rounded player that gets sniped out of the game. And because I do think Darnell is pretty much a lock for a cast like this, and I feel like him swapping out with Wendell just kind of makes sense. Next, I'm moving on to Adam, and Adam here ends up being replaced by the other of the returning players on the board. Again, this time it's a guy, and obviously through that you can narrow down who those first boots would have been. Though, to be fair, both of these people do have reservations in terms of them eventually coming back. The person that didn't make it on was Vetus, who I think would have been likely to be on this cast had it not been for the fact that he left Ponderosa and clearly pissed off production during Cambodia through that. So the person I did put on might be a little bit of a question mark, but I did put on Johnny Fairplay. Now, Fairplay obviously is noted as having this very hostile relationship with Jeff Probst, and through that people think that he is kind of barred from ever playing Survivor again. However, I don't think that's necessarily the case, especially in the modern day. I think if this was closer to when those events happened, I think that probably would have been the case. However, I think we're pretty far removed from that to where Jeff has kind of let it go. And considering this is a first boot season, where again, you're already kind of struggling to have these big characters. When you have Fairplay as someone that you can bring back here, I just don't see them not taking this opportunity. So again, for me, he was a pretty easy pick to make here. Next, I'm moving on to Tyson, and this is one that straight up, this is not a 1-for-1 comparison at all. And to be fair, I didn't even try. There's no first boot that's like Tyson in Survivor history. So instead, I just went for a random guy that I think could make the cast, and here I did end up going with Sekou. Now, Sekou was the last pick for the guys in my mind here. I do feel like Sekou is definitely one of the bigger question marks on the board here. I don't know if he would want to come back or if production would want him back. However, again, when we later get to all the men that didn't make the cast, there aren't that many. And straight up, I mean, he was essentially fighting for a spot with Chicken. Well, I personally probably would rather have Chicken back. I do feel like he's still pretty similar to other people that are on the cast, while Sekou does feel different. And obviously adds diversity as well, to where I just felt like Sekou made for a better pick here. Next up, we're moving on to Sophie, and this one's a pretty easy swap out in my eyes. I mean, first up, I did consider Francesca, though I think considering the fact that Francesca doesn't want to play again, I just decided to leave her off entirely, though once we do that, it's a very easy swap. I think you got So Kim here. So Kim, kind of being similar to Sophie in the fact that they're both, again, from white-collar occupations. I believe So Kim is probably one of the more intelligent people on the board here from a first boot standpoint, so I think that's also a parallel. And really just in general, I feel like So Kim's obviously a lock on this season. I mean, they've been trying to bring her back for like no reason for a while now, to where she's obviously just completely locked for her first boot season. So again, this was an easy choice to make here. Next, moving on to Kim Spradlin, and the person I swapped her out for here is someone that I don't even know if is on production's radars at this point. However, all the women on this field here, I feel like she feels different from a lot of the other women on the actual cast, and because I did pick Nicole Delma, who again, like, isn't necessarily a big lock on a first boot season, though again, when looking at the board here, Nicole does feel different from a lot of the other women that end up making the cast here, where she's, again, from an earlier season. At this point, she's in her 40s, I believe, has kids, and kind of fits into a different archetype than the likes of like a Marisa or a Carolina Gonzalez. Like, she does feel like a different archetype to me, and because of that, she stood out a bit more when putting this cast together. So again, she made it on here. Next, moving on to Jeremy, and Jeremy's where I'm swapping him out with another one of these more physical first boots, and that person is Brooke. Now again, Brooke is the person I mentioned earlier, to where I do feel like Brooke could have swapped out for someone like a Yule, even could have swapped out for someone like a Tyson. Though again, to keep with physical strength and keep it kind of balanced between the tribes, I decided to put him in Jeremy's spot here, as I did feel like the Sele tribe needed some stronger competitors. And Brooke is someone that, again, I don't know if he's really on production's radar, but again, when they're doing a first boot season, I mean, they kind of have to bring back someone like a Brooke, considering the fact that, again, there's not that many men to pick from. And he's at least distinct enough. I mean, he's this massive super fan of the show, obviously had this very disappointing run his first time around. I do think there's a nice redemption arc for him on a return, and again, feels different enough from the rest of the other first boots to where he definitely made it on here. Next, moving on to Nick, and Nick had a relatively easy replacement here. I mean, another like kind of problematic person, and here we're picking Ryan Aiken. And Ryan for me was definitely a question mark on whether or not I should put him on the cast. As again, Ryan Aiken, someone that I don't really have any interest in seeing in play Survivor again. But again, like, I think when like trying to add physical strength to this cast and also bring up these like different archetypes, I feel like Ryan Aiken being this, at least at the time, younger, cocky kind of douchebag, I think is a bit different. Now, I guess technically him and Brooke are like somewhat similar, though I think Brooke's like super fandom, while Ryan's complete aloofness in the game is like something that separates the two. But also, it's been like, I mean, 20 years now, but at least at the time Survivor 40 would have been 17 years since his original season. I mean, you would assume he would have changed quite a bit in that time. And just overall, while he's not someone that I necessarily need to see back, again, when looking at the men that were eligible for this list, I feel like he made a lot of sense here. Next, moving on to Denise, and Denise is probably the one of the most contentious swap outs in my mind, where this is one where there's just so many people that can fill her archetype, filling in this like older woman archetype, one that, again, there's a lot of first boots in that archetype. I mean, we had the likes of a Sonia, a Deb, a Diane, Timbertina, Wendy Jo, Katrina Radke. Like, so many women could have fit this spot here. However, all of them did not make it on. Timbertina's probably the closest, considering I do feel like there's at least this more sympathetic story for her coming back, while others like Sonia, Diane, I don't know if they're in the shape to play again. Deb is someone that clearly wouldn't want to play again. Katrina, I just feel like they kind of purpled. And then Wendy, I think they're just kind of lukewarm on. The person I went with here is someone that was probably a lock for this cast if this was Survivor 40, and that person is Reem. And obviously Reem is the person that, of the first boots, at least on their respective seasons, is the person that we got the most airtime from. She was obviously on the entire season, though she is still technically a first boot, and I do think she would have been included in this list here. Again, someone that I think production would be willing to bring back, and I think for first boot season they would be happily wanting to have her back there. So for me, again, this was kind of an easy pick. Next for Ben, and Ben kind of ends up being like this similar spot for the remaining men on the cast. This like slot where the remaining men were all fighting for the same spot, though to be fair, not as many men eligible here. Again, you had someone like a Jim Lynch who probably wouldn't be put on the show nowadays. John Raymond is obviously John Raymond, so he's not going to be on. So at that point, we're left with a first boot that, again, like when I do my first boot ranking, I don't include this person. However, I feel like Survivor Production would include this person. That person is Pat Cusick. And again, Pat's another one that was a big lock for a season like this at the time of Survivor 40. Again, they very much wanted to bring him back by the time of Survivor 40, to where, again, like having Pat back for this season makes a lot of sense. And I should also mention that someone like a Courtney Moon was eligible for this cast as well. However, I also just don't feel like they would have brought back Courtney Moon. But Pat, though, I think is someone that, again, they were very much wanting to bring back, and I feel like this is a decent spot for him. Next, moving on to Sarah Lucina. And here, I feel like there was a decent enough replacement for her. Again, again, one of the more physical women to be booted first, and that person is Yolanda from Palau. Now again, obviously there's the argument of, okay, is Wanda and Jonathan the first boots? And while I could see production going that route, I do feel like they would go Yolanda instead. And again, I think Yolanda is probably someone that would make more sense for this cast. Again, adds more diversity. Also, it's just, again, one of the stronger women on the board here, and to me, it makes a lot of sense for her to be here. Next, moving on to Michelle. And Michelle's replacement, again, was kind of in contention with some of the women we talked about previously. People like a Michelle Chase, people like a Marissa. However, the person I end up going with here is someone that I think production is higher on as a whole, and that person is Jessica DeBen, who, again, feels like a random pick at this point. Again, no one really talks about Jessica DeBen. However, Jessica DeBen is also someone that Jeff Probst really likes for some reason, someone that he really hyped up back in the day. And I do feel like on a first boot season, where obviously you're very limited on who to bring back, I do feel like someone like Jessica DeBen feels like the type of person that they would give a shot to. So again, I went with her here. Next up, Natalie Anderson, and this is really obvious, right? I mean, her replacement would obviously be Nadia Anderson, because obviously, but still also would have an interesting storyline. Her sister won the previous season. She was the first boot, and that could lead to an interesting trajectory for her here. And finally, we have the winner in Tony, and who is his replacement? Which, again, to me, very easy pick here. I think the person that feels the most Tony-like of the first boots is Zayn. For Zayn is probably one of the most chaotic and most aggressive first boots in Survivor history, playing this very Hansian style game. And through that, again, he was kind of the first person that came to my mind of who would be on in Tony's place here. And because that, again, made this a very easy pick. But there we go. I mean, that is my essential recasting of Survivor Winners at War as a first boot season. Now, again, I did essentially do these 1-for-1 swaps to where I do have these tribes here. So on the DeCall tribe, I did put on Carolina Eastwood, Darnell Hamilton, David Sampson, Jolanda Jones, Nicole Delma, Ryan Aiken, Sekou Bunch, So Kim, Tina Wesson, and Zayn Knight. While on the Sele tribe, I did put on Brooke Garrity, Jessica DeBen, Johnny Fairplay, Marissa Callahan, Nadia Anderson, Pat Cusick, Peter Harkey, Reem Daly, Ronnie Bardaw, and Stephanie Gonzalez. And that is the video, a video that I've been wanting to do for a while, even though it's such a stupid idea. But to be fair, I think this is actually kind of a fun thing to potentially try out with future style returning seasons, maybe like a runner-ups. Maybe like a runner-up season, a Fallen Juror season, stuff like that. So maybe I'll do those down the road. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.